Fantastic. So some of you have thought about the questions that you would like to ask Naomi and Mungi, and you have shared those with us. And those of you who are listening and are hearing about this for the first time, I am certain that these questions are important to you. And so I want to move through these questions and hand over the floor to Mungi and Naomi as they respond to them. So first of all, we have some questions from our primary school, Abraham Moss. And we're going to start with, what has inspired you to get involved in campaigning for human rights globally? Over to you, Naomi and Mungi.
Hi, everyone. It is so lovely to see you all today. Hopefully I don't bore you. I know that you could probably be outside playing, so I won't talk too long, I promise. What has inspired me? So I think, as my bio kind of says, is it was sort of something that was just in my genes. I think that in my family, the suffering of others sort of physically affects us. And so, when I see other people suffering, it makes me feel sick. It makes me want to cry. And so naturally, you don't ignore that. You sort of lean into that and lean into how you can bring about human rights. And as you said about Robert F. Kennedy and dignity for human beings, that is what Ubuntu is about. It's about respecting the inherent worth and dignity of humans. And so naturally, human rights sort of puts that at the forefront and focuses on that. And then also I had, amazing role models to look up to, my mother and my grandfather, and their friends and close family who were all activists. And so also, I couldn't just not do that either. That would have been a bit embarrassing.
That's fantastic. What are some of the other human rights icons that you both admire most, and why?
So I think that for me, having had the opportunity to be around particularly Nobel Peace Prize winners. So when I think I hold up people like Shirin Ebadi from Iran, Betty Williams and Mairead Maguire from Ireland, who were so instrumental in bringing peace to Northern Ireland. Definitely, you cannot not say President Nelson Mandela obviously has been a hero since I was very little. People like Albertina Sisulu, who is known most as the wife of Walter Sisulu, but was such an important activist in her own right in South Africa. Winnie Mandela, who I grew up down the street from and was not just a role model as an activist, but also a person who I saw how she lived in the community. So yeah, I was definitely spoiled for choice.
That's a beautiful way of putting it, surrounded by so many incredible and powerful, people who use their power to create change, who became agents of change, were not necessarily born with power at all. And just focusing on icons for a little bit longer, how do you both feel being the daughter and the granddaughter of Archbishop Desmond Tutu, who has a phenomenal reputation worldwide? But the one thing that I remember most about Desmond Tutu is when he was over here in England, and I was lucky enough to be at an event where he was speaking, and something humorous came up, something funny came up, and he laughed so loud and with the whole of his body that his feet lifted off the ground on his chair, and you couldn't help but be infected by that joy and that laughter that he was sharing with all of us in that room. How do you feel about being part of his family, about in some ways continuing his legacy, but also creating your own?
Should I go first?
You can go first.
Okay. Also, I want to say bless you to, I think someone at Abraham Moss was just sneezing. So the honest answer is very, very lucky, because you get to experience things that some people don't, where they're big learning opportunities, and also meet amazing people. But then on the other hand, there's this sort of great imposter syndrome that happens, especially when you sort of want to follow in someone's footsteps. And so I don't know if everyone knows what imposter syndrome is, but it's basically sort of the belief that, you know, the achievements that you have and the success that you get isn't necessarily down to what you've done. You think that it has to do with someone else. And so sometimes, you know, there are moments where I wonder, has this happened, or this person invited me to this thing because of my grandfather, or is there something that I'm offering? And so there are those moments of doubt. But then you have to remember that you can, you know, build your legacy alongside that. It doesn't necessarily have to be behind or below someone else's.
Mm. And when you talk about his laughter, I have to first of all say that as a family, we're constantly trying to tell him it's okay to laugh, but you're not supposed to laugh at your own jokes before other people do, because that is what he does, right? But you know, growing up with him as my father, so he was not the Nobel Peace Prize winner when I was growing up. He was not world renowned when I was growing up. He was known as a priest in South Africa, and that. And I think what Mungi said, that for me, the most powerful part of it was the access that we got to people, even growing up, that people like Barney Pichane, like Steve Biko, those kind of people that we were exposed to as young people because of my father's role in the anti-apartheid movement. And so for me, the greatest gift has probably been the exposure to so many people, and the ability then to make the connection around acts of human rights, that when you're fighting apartheid, it is connected to fighting for the liberation of Palestine. When you're fighting for environmental justice, it is connected to fighting racism and anti-immigrant sentiments in the US. So the fact of being able to have been shown the ways in which human rights activism is all connected. And so getting the sense that it doesn't matter what struggle you decide is the struggle that you identify most with, that whichever struggle for human rights that you take up, you are taking up the whole struggle for human rights.
That's incredibly powerful, and that you, by taking up that struggle, essentially become part of a movement where there are so many other people in times that have gone before you and working alongside you that bring different skills, but different abilities, different qualities to that movement. And every single person who chooses to engage has something magnificent, something beautiful to offer to that cause.
Yes,
that's incredible. And you mentioned, Naomi, the of course apartheid. In your own ways, you would have different experiences of apartheid and the anti-apartheid movement. Could you share with us maybe a story or something that you feel appropriate to share with everybody here today about your experience of that time and how that's impacted the work that you do today?
Yes, I think what I always say to people is that when you talk to Black South Africans, everybody can tell you the story that for them was the realization of apartheid, right? That as a little child, what was the thing that made you recognize the system that you were living in? And for me, the first real that I can remember is that when my father was teaching at the Federal Seminary in the Eastern Cape, the Federal Seminary was one of the only places in South Africa where the campus was an interracial campus. So faculty and staff lived on campus, and Black, white, colored, Asian, we were all in that community. However, once you stepped off the campus, you were fully in apartheid South Africa. And what that meant for us was that whereas all the other the white children on campus went to school in town down the street from where we lived and came home for lunch every day, that my siblings and the other Black children on campus, when I went to boarding school at 6.5, because my parents sent us to a neighboring country, Swaziland, in order to get a quality education. So for me, that experience of my neighbors are able to just go to school and live with their families their whole year round. And for me to have the same opportunity, my parents must drive us 2 days away from home. And on that drive, know that there are gas stations where we can put gas in our cars, but the bathrooms say whites only, and the eating facilities say whites only, so that my parents had to plan out those 2 days, knowing which were the places we could have bathroom facilities, where were the places we could buy food. But most of the time we just carried our own food for that whole 2 days. And so that was my first experience of how apartheid personally impacted my life. And then obviously, as you grow up, the experiences of having family members arrested for not having their passes, all of those things then become a lived reality.
Wow, thank you.
Well, I was born as apartheid was ending. So, I don't say that I lived through it, because I don't know if anyone has memories of when they were 2 years old, but I don't. So I think acknowledging that I haven't been through that sort of trauma, I think what really hit me learning about it when I was younger is when we would go to different museums and I would think, okay, we're reading about things that are happening, we're seeing things that are happening. And then there was one time where we went and it finally clicked for me that these things happened to my mother. And when someone harms someone you love, that's where it really does hurt you, because, we can get hurt and we can move forward, but it's when the people that we love get hurt, it's a bit more difficult. And that is, for me, is what was the most difficult thing, is just to think that she has gone through these things and is now who she is today, the most forgiving and loving. And so if she's gone through that, then the rough times that I have are nothing compared to that. And so surely I can show a bit more forgiveness when it comes to someone hurting me in a different way.
Yeah, absolutely. Sometimes as human beings, we can tolerate something happening to us to some degree, but to tolerate that even when it's happening to someone you know, someone you love, someone you've seen walking past you every day in your local streets, it's really, really difficult. And it just brings attention to the fact that as a humanity, all of these things are these issues, and also for us people, all of these things are interconnected. Yeah. Really, really powerful. And Mungi, how has that encouraged you, or how have your early years, whether it's education or other experiences, encouraged you to create change? And what has that changed for you? What does that change look like?
I think encouraged me in the way that my family has been through things that most of us could not imagine going through. But even though that is true, there are people on this earth now going through things that are worse than that. And so how can we be at this stage of our sort of development in both human rights and technology and still allow people to suffer in this way? And as I said about, the sort of hurt that I feel when I see someone suffering, and the pit in my stomach and the crying. I don't like to cry, but I do cry when I see, someone else getting harmed. And I know that I got that from my mother, because she has the same sort of physical reaction. I think it pushed me to just say, okay, if I'm feeling this way, seeing this, how is this person feeling? And how are they surviving day to day and still somehow showing joy and generosity to others? And so I guess I went with what I connected most with. I was always very lucky to have a great education. So how could, I make sure that girls have this sort of same experience as me, where they can have a great education, where you're allowed to be independent and you're allowed to be smart and, you know, to think on your own 2 feet and decide where you want to go in life. And so that's sort of where I directed my change and where I thought I'd be going. But then, you know, they say you plan and God laughs. And so I think we all know about everything that happened in the US last summer. And all of a sudden I sort of saw that my voice and my change needed to be aimed at racism in the US, because this was something that hit me directly. I have a younger brother who, when he's in America, my mother and I are very nervous. And so some of it is partly selfish, but also I think you have an idea of the change you want to make, but sometimes you need to just follow where it takes you. And right now that is dealing with racism in the US and the UK and the wider world.
And just on that, you mentioned that the Black Lives Matter movement, and many of us know that this movement has roots way back to, you know, to the periods of slavery, to some really toxic, awful things that have happened throughout history in relation to particularly Black people and more broadly people of color. How important has this movement been to you? You talk about the personal sort of the emotions that it strikes inside of you, how you feel about loved ones. More broadly speaking, how powerful do you think this movement is, and how has it felt to you as somebody who navigates all of these different spaces and is somebody who is Black herself?
I think the power in it lies in that Black youth are being told on a sort of grander scale, instead of just in their homes, in our homes, that we do matter, our lives matter. We are just as worthy of dignity and respect as our peers. And again, you know, it's sad that these are the things that we sort of have to discuss and focus on in 2021. But I think it's one of the most important movements, because if we, you know, cherish those that are actually most vulnerable, everybody else wins. So in the US, if we were to actually cherish and treat Black women with respect, everyone else would be successful and soar from that, because Black women are basically at the bottom of the totem pole. And I think there's maybe two sides to the coin with the movement, because great, it's wonderful, we have it, and people, you know, feel very strongly about it, but then there are the people that feel negatively. And so my mind is partially like, thank God for this movement, but then I'm like, why are there people that still disagree with it? You know, I can't logically figure out how Black lives mattering detracts from anyone else's life mattering. And so it's sort of the constant struggle of, don't focus on the negative that people bring out, because the movement is about love and respect and dignity. And so I think it is very important.
Yeah, and I mean, I think it's important, and for somebody of my generation, there's a level of sadness too, that our young people are having to be giving voice to the same things that we were giving voice to when we were young. That how is it that our world has not moved forward? You know, when we had our first democratic election in South Africa in 1994, Mungi was 2, as she said. And the night that they declared Nelson Mandela the winner, there was a huge celebration on the streets of Soweto. And so I took my 2-year-old Mungi, I put her on my back, I strapped her on my back, and I went out on the street because I wanted her to be able to say, however many years later, I was there when this wonderful thing happened. And I was hoping that this was the beginning of the end of racism, not just in South Africa, but around the world. And here we are almost 30 years later. I know you're not quite 30, sweetie, but we're almost there. And we are having young people having to be out on the street defending the rights of Black people to be free in the country that they are citizens or visitors or immigrants to. That the very fact that here we are in 2021, still having to say to people that Black Lives Matter is in a way a sadness for me.
Yeah. It's incredible listening to you, because so many other questions sort of spark in my mind to ask you. And I just want to take a moment, Mungi, to ask you about your work around women and girls, because we've had the Black Lives Matter movement, and it does feel like we arrived at a tipping point, which is a very important moment in how we make human rights a reality for everybody. But we've also had other movements, particularly Me Too, all sorts of campaigns around the emancipation of women's bodies, women's voices. Could you share with us something about your reflections on how you feel about the movement that's taken place in that area of work too?
Well, coming from the US, where, you know, this sort of restriction on women's bodies is a constant struggle and debate that is mostly led by men, it's a bit frightening. The reason I thought that focusing on the education of women and girls is important is because, you know, I think once we're educated, we actually are way more equipped to speak to what we need. We are, even if we're not educated, but I think we then, I'll just say, women are very clever. And I think that instead of sort of being a voice for the voiceless, as some people like to say, it's about sort of giving people your platform. And so I think with education, you sort of are opening your platform, giving someone their own platform to speak from. And so, I mean, where we are in the movement, I don't know that we're that much farther than we are in the movement to end racism, because, you know, there is feminism, but we still all argue about what feminism means. We can't agree that that in the US, there's this sort of debate between white feminism and the feminism of women of color. And so I think in the same way that we are at this sort of great space, but again, sort of sad that we're still having these discussions, it's similar to racism to me, if that makes sense. It's sort of all intertwined.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And it goes back to that point about how interconnected all of these things are. I also, if you don't mind, some of our young people are interested in how you yourselves have encountered and then dealt with or processed or moved through encounters that are racist. If there's anything that you feel suitable that you could share, maybe a short example or an experience, if you wish.
You want to go? Or you want to think about it?
Trying to think of examples.
Okay, yeah. I can share if you.
Yeah, I can talk about how I moved through it. No, you go. Okay.
So, I mean, you know, growing up in South Africa, there are many experiences, but I think that a couple that stand out for me is, again, road trips were a big thing. And on a road trip from my high school in Swaziland to do a visit with a school in South Africa. And we stopped, and our school was a multiracial school. It was founded as a multiracial school in Swaziland, mostly for South Africans. And so on this field hockey trip, I was a field hockey star, in my own mind at least. And on this trip, we were in South Africa, had the bus stopped to fill, and we all climbed out of the bus to go and get some snacks. And there were just two white girls on our field hockey team. And they, for some reason, I don't know why, but they had got off first and went to the bathroom, and we followed them. And the owner came out as one of the non-white girls was in the bathroom and told the rest of us that we could not use the bathroom. Fortunately for us, our teacher came over and was like, no, you are not going to stop our girls using, because he was a white man. And so there's some, there's some leeway that white people were given to challenge racism in a way that as Black people we weren't. And so we were, but the experience of having somebody who is a classmate, a teammate, a friend, with nothing else to say for them except for the color of their skin, not even being questioned about what they did. And straight away, when it was us having that, it also made some tension even between us as people, just because that is, to be in that experience, it is something about, oh, so the world is saying that these two are better than the rest of us. So it's not just having to work through that this is the idiocy of racism and it's an idiotic thing and just let it go, but also then it has an impact on how you then interact with people who you are friends with, who you are close to, that all of a sudden we're in South Africa and I could feel myself, thinking through, like when I cussed out one of my white friends on the street, that, oh, wait a minute, this can be taken as a crime. And where in a normal situation, when friends cuss one another out,
none of them cuss their friends out.
I know you don't cuss your friends out, and please don't cuss your friends out. It is not a good thing, but some friends sometimes need to be cussed out. Mama. And so we, in a loving way, cuss out your friends in a loving way, only in a loving way. And so, that those conflicts that you would work through normally as teenagers, as young people, you work through your conflicts with one another, but then all of a sudden race is imposed even on your personal life story, your friendships, and it does make a difference. And having to work through, not just for myself, but even with those friends, about, let us be clear about our relationship and not allow the racism that surrounds us to impact the way we deal with one another.
And Mungi, a time when you moved through something that happened?
I mean, there are so many times. I think, as any way that you could be discriminated against as a woman has happened, and as a Black person has happened, and then you compound them. And sometimes, I will be honest, in the moment you don't realize, that you feel sort of weird in your body, like something was said, you may not understand it, you may not know, you're sort of going off of body language and tone, and you don't know why something upsets you. And in my old young age, I've now learned that it's okay you don't need to react, you don't need to respond. My therapist likes to say, be amused, not abused. So you can actually ask someone to clarify what they're saying. Because when someone makes a joke and then they're asked to clarify their joke, it's not funny anymore. And they feel the weight of that. But I also think that you can sort of move backwards in silence and check in with yourself on, why did that make me feel weird? What was it? And you may never figure it out. You may figure it out years later when you're my age. But I think you don't always have to respond. You're allowed to take time for yourself. And I think we're in a world where everyone we need to have a clever response. We need to be quick with something, but sometimes you may say something you don't want to say. And so I think just actually checking in with yourself. And if that means you need to cry, crying in the shower is very cathartic, feels great. If you need to take a nap, naps are reparation, do that. Or as I do, speak to my mom. Find sort of your confidant and the people that you rely on to sort of help you move through it and work through it, because that discrimination says more about the person than it does about you.
That's really, really powerful. I can resonate with all of those pieces of advice. I think expressing your emotions, crying is something that we all deserve a safe space to be able to pour ourselves out in some way. And then talking to somebody is incredibly, incredibly powerful. But finding somebody you can trust, who knows you,
Yeah.
who cares for you deeply, and who wants the best for you, that's really, really powerful. I want to move on to, these are all very, very difficult subjects, and human rights is a difficult subject, of course. So we really appreciate that the way in which you're giving your whole self to this conversation. It's really powerful. One of our students in Fairlange, Reem, she asks, despite all of the efforts that we've spoken about and those we haven't spoken about to end discrimination, racism still continues to exist in many, many parts of the world. How do you feel about this? How can we end it, she says? And also, what advice or guidance would you offer people as they think about creating change in their communities when it comes to discrimination, when it comes to racism?
Oh, great question. I mean, so yeah, as I said when I'm talking about the Black Lives Matter movement, that there is a sadness for me that we are still dealing with racism, and in fact, we are seeing heightened racism around the world, acts of violence against people of color in the United States and around the world, and so it is frustrating at many levels to be to have seen, for instance, the struggle against apartheid and to get to a place where we have a democratic election, and then to realize that the economic fundamentals of racism are still in place, even in South Africa, that the economy is still controlled. 80% of the wealth is still in the hands of the white minority. So that reality, yes, is saddening, but for me is also the impetus to carry on the struggle for justice. And one of the things, as I spoke about earlier, about having the opportunity to be around so many people who have dedicated their lives to the struggle for human rights, has been the recognition that the struggle calls us from wherever we are. And if we care about our own human rights, if we care about our own dignity, if we care about being respected, then we have to care about how others are treated. And in particular, when we talk about racism and discrimination, that the reality is we all suffer from the results of racism and discrimination. And we all suffer in ways that we cannot measure. So we suffer because Black people of color, spend so much of their energy having to protect themselves from racism, that the wonderful gift that we have, the wonderful creativeness that exists in our communities, that we cannot get access to all of that wonderful creativity and energy because so much of it is focused on surviving the day-to-day experiences of racism and discrimination. So for me, that in and of itself says that we have to continue this struggle. We have to continue this struggle because we know that our whole world cannot be a world of justice and peace, and cannot give us each opportunities to expand our horizons if it doesn't give it to everybody. At least that is what I have been taught, and that is what I believe, that none of us are free until we are all free. And as long as there is racism, white people will never be free.
And I think, yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And Elena and Jennifer are particularly interested in how we can continue to create change that bends towards that arc of justice? And how can we all as different kinds of communities engage in that struggle, engage in that liberation of people who are oppressed?
So whenever I speak to friends about this, I explain it that we all have our different strengths, and everyone's sort of activism can look different. And so to my friends of color, I say, you know, speak when you want to speak, educate when you want to educate, but like it's not our job, because we did not create racism. And when you're tired, take a break, because we need you with full energy and fervor. And then to my white friends, I say, when you hear something or see something, call it out. Have difficult conversations, be uncomfortable, have conversations with family members or friends that may say something inappropriate or harsh, because you are their family. If I come to them and say something, it may come off like I'm attacking, and my words will just not have the same weight as you. And so you have to be the one leading this conversation. I can tell you about my experience, but I need you to then share this with your family and friends, because I'm not a trusted messenger for them, and you are. And so if you can be a trusted messenger to people about, you know, the horrors of racism and the harms that it causes to all of us, then I think that is like the first step and one of the easiest steps to take.
I think what also our young people are looking for is that sort of day-to-day interventions, the interventions that they can make, yes, of course. And they're also curious about whether they should be taught about racial injustice, systemic racism, the roots of racism, and those sorts of things. Or do you feel that teaching young people those sorts of subjects may be inappropriate? What are your thoughts?
I think we definitely have to teach young people. I think young people are way smarter than we give them credit for, and way more aware of their surroundings. And so instead of this notion that, you know, young people don't notice difference, let's lean into the questions that they have to ask, because they are the future. And so I think these things need to be taught. And in the US right now, there's a sort of debate over whether or not we teach these things. And I don't know how you move forward or learn from your history if you've never been taught your history.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Yeah. And I think, you know, and the reality is that Black families are teaching their children about racism just for them to be able to survive, right? So we teach them before they walk out the door about what they need to know about the system and about how we got to where we are. And we're not doing history for the sake of history with our children. We are doing history for the sake of survival for our children. And it would be wonderful if the whole community was being taught this history, because then it would not be about simply the survival, a teaching for survival. It would be a teaching for the thriving of the whole community. That, as Mungi says, when we learn our history, we can learn the lessons from our history. When we know our history, we can see the mistakes. We can see the places that we did wrong. We can see the places where our ancestors did right. And we can learn not to repeat their mistakes and to build on their successes. But if we don't share those stories, then we keep on making the same mistakes, causing the same kinds of conflicts, and dividing our world and our community in the same way that then limits the ability of all of us to thrive.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of this, there's a really intriguing question, and I really want to pay attention to it. It has come from Sarah at Fairlange, and Sarah says, "What do you think?" And I'm going to say, as she has written it, "What do you think? How would you have done what you do today without Reverend Desmond Tutu by our or your side?"
So I would like to think that even if Desmond Tutu were not my father, that as a Black South African raised and having experienced apartheid, and also having experienced a community of faith that I came out of. So, you know, when people talk to me about my faith, they always expect me to say that, you know, my faith teachers were my parents, especially my father. After all, he's an ordained minister, right? But my real faith teacher was my grandmother, my father's mother, who was illiterate, who left school when she was very young, was a domestic worker, but her relationship with God was one that allowed her, in the midst of a system that told her that she was less than, that she never believed that, and she would not let us believe that about ourselves. That I had a conversation with her, I remember when I was young, about paintings in our church, and all the paintings in the church were of white people, and God was white, and all the angels were white, and this was a Black church. Everybody surrounding God was white, and I was like to her, so how can we be worshiping this God who doesn't look like us and doesn't even surround himself with anybody who looks like us? There's nobody like us in heaven. So how can this be the God that we worship? And she was like, well, you know, we did not paint that God. The person who painted that God decided to paint God in his own image. And the truth is that we were created in God's image, and not that but then people now try and create God in their image. So having that person as my understanding of faith and of who God is in my life has been what has sustained me. And I would like to believe that even if my father had never won the Nobel Peace Prize and never been famous, the fact of that first experience of God with my grandmother would have still held me through to this point where I would continue to be a struggler for justice.
That's amazing. I mean, you're a born preacher, Naomi, and if I'm going to take one thing away from that, is that we are all created in the image of God. And Mungi, I want to give the last words to you as we move into the last few minutes of this amazing conversation. It's an interesting question, right? There's so much packed into that question.
Yeah. And I don't know the answer. I want to think that I would be in a similar place, because, you know, we talk about human rights today, and there are a lot of people that say, you know, I would have done this in the civil rights era. We are now in a civil rights era. And so what you are doing now is what you would have been doing during the civil rights movement in the US. And so I like to think I'm doing something. So I hope that even if I didn't have this example so close to me, I would still have looked upon leaders who were able to show forgiveness in times of great oppression, and to hold on to hope and joy and laughter when they could find it. And I would think even if there wasn't a Desmond Tutu, there would still be Ubuntu. And I am not religious like my mother clearly is. And so Ubuntu is sort of my faith. And I like to think that even if Desmond Tutu was not around, Ubuntu would still be this sort of guiding light and principle that we would live by, that would remind me of my inherent dignity and worth, and would propel me to make sure that people understood that about themselves as well. Mm-hmm. But I'm not sure. That's what I would like to think, and I hope.
Yeah, it's very difficult unless you actually experience something. As human beings, we just don't know how we will respond, how we will react, who we will become. Could you just share with us, Mungi, a little bit more about Ubuntu and how it has inspired you, how it has become such an integral part of who you are?
Yeah. So really who I learned it from was my mother, because we were raised in the US, hence this weird accent of mine. And she made sure that even though we were living in America, that we still were sort of South African children in the home. And so, you know, it was about how we treated our elders and how my brother and I were raised to treat each other, even when we were arguing. And I don't know when it sort of became an important thing to me, but around the age of 15, I really, really wanted to get a tattoo of Ubuntu. And my mom said, not until you're 21. And I was like, well, that's weird, because when I'm 18, I can do whatever I want. And she said, not if you want me to pay for it. So I, you know, kept trying, kept waiting. And Ubuntu was just always sort of around us. And when I turned 21, I got the tattoo of Ubuntu. Please don't go home and tell your parents that I told you to get tattoos, because that's not what I'm saying. And then a few years later, someone reached out to me and asked me to write a book about Ubuntu. And I was like, well, this is just so weird. I'm sort of in a point in my life where I don't know what's happening. And also, this seems like it's meant to be, because I have a tattoo of Ubuntu. It's very important to me. Of course, I'd love to work on writing this book. And as I said, it's sort of my faith. I don't find my faith in church and in organized religion. And so I think that Ubuntu, thank God for my mom that she sort of brought us up with it around, is where I find my strength and my joy, and is sort of my guiding to how I should treat people. It doesn't mean that I'm perfect every day or that I always do what is good and right, but it's sort of the knowledge that you will continue to try to do what is good and right. And so you will not only forgive others, you will forgive yourself when you make a mistake, and sort of grant yourself grace, because no one can do Ubuntu better than someone else. You know, you're constantly learning and growing. And if that is sort of the knowledge that you carry with you through life, then I think you're doing Ubuntu the right way.
And we're really looking forward to reading your book, Everyday Ubuntu. If you could just hold it up for us, Mungi.
It's really small, so easy read.
Easy to read. So we're really excited to be able to get your book. I know we are out of time. I just want to take a few moments to say a huge thank you to all of the schools who have participated: Abraham Moss, Christ the King, multiple year groups in Abraham Moss, over at Fairlange, the Derby, Ladybridge. We are so grateful for each and every one of you young people for being able to tolerate this pandemic, to be able to sit in your bubbles, to be patient when your bubbles burst and you have to go home. And we know that happens so many times, and that your learning is different this year to the years before. Hopefully, all being well, we are all deeply hoping that when we return back to school in September, that things will be better, that we will have a new normal where we will all be able to hang out with our friends, engage in learning, and it doesn't always have to be through Zoom. So I just want to, on behalf of us all the grown-ups here, to say a huge well done, and that we are so very proud of you. Also to say a huge thank you to the teachers. You are phenomenal, absolutely phenomenal. Thank you for all that you do. Thank you for all that we know about, but actually a lot of the work that you do, we don't even know about. So we are in deep appreciation, and thank you for sharing the questions from the children as well. And then our final gratitude and thanks goes, Mungi, to you for your phenomenal voice that you have shared with us today, for the work that you do. We haven't even explored the work around women and girls, and maybe there'll be an opportunity to do that in the future. But you really are an inspiration, somebody who has been able to embrace everything that has come your way, even some of the toxicity, to be able to move through it and become something even stronger and more vibrant, and for it to affect your message. Just the way that you handle everything that you've experienced, and the values and the passions that you have through your work and through this book, which I'm really excited to read. We're really grateful. And we're especially grateful that you were able to bring your mum along. Rev Naomi Tutu, you really are to me, you may be all the way in Portugal and on Zoom, but your spark, your energy just shines through. We're very, very grateful for your voice. And we're also very grateful that you had Mungi and that you raised your children in the way that you did. And we have
I'm grateful too.
We have Mungi's voice today. So a huge thank you to everybody for this really, really special conversation.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you so much.
We have recorded the conversation, so we're going to be able to share that with everybody here and with everybody who was not able to be here because of all sorts of complications in schools. And so watch out for the video on social media and come back and watch it again, or watch it with your parents or with your family members whenever you're able to. So one huge thank you. Can we unmute the videos from our schools for a second and just offer a huge round of applause and lots of noise for Mungi and Naomi. We feel that energy. We feel that love. That's incredible.
They're just excited to go home.
Thank you so much, everybody. Have a
beautiful
afternoon. And